This is a paper that I'm working on, which is, as you can see, is interested in mood monitoring. But just to explain where I come from, I'm an economic sociologist, and I'm interested in this primarily as a particular example of evaluation practice, a way of trying to represent and quantify and compare value in certain situations. And although some of what I'm going to talk about might be considered to be examples of quantified self-type practices, I'm not going to be addressing the quantified self as such. And it's not a kind of frame for what I'm going to talk about that is all that significant for me, for reasons that I'm going to talk about. So I want to try and put the question of mood tracking, mood monitoring, into a slightly different history, less a history of computing and more a history of the longer history of attempt to capture happiness as an object of various types of social science, the whole way back to Jeremy Bentham. I'm not going to go that far back today, but that's what my book, The Happiness Industry, tried to do. And I became interested, since writing that book, in the sense of that happiness or positive affect might be something that is worth trying to capture now, which is, for various reasons, something that digital technologies offer the capacity to do. And I was very struck by Tony Sampson's talk yesterday about this turn towards the kind of experiential mode of management, which I think provides some of the context for some of the things I'm going to talk about today. Now, these are some of the apps that you're probably familiar with, these sorts of things. You may not use them. I've been using them. I was going to kind of do an autoethnography, but they started driving me insane, and I just couldn't sort of go. Well, I'm not going to report the findings today anyway. These are some of the apps that are available. Got a Feeling. This is a project at the LSE which produces something called Mappiness. This is something called Mood Notes. This is just something called Happiness, and this is something called Mood Panda. And these are all examples of ways in which you can monitor your mood in some kind of close to real-time manner nowadays. But I think that it's worth also recognizing that we're surrounded in our everyday lives now by other interfaces that do something similar. These aren't things that go in your pocket and they don't identify you in the same way, but that there is a kind of everyday interface that we come across increasingly nowadays, which does something quite similar. I took this photo in the British Library. That, the top, is the new Smart Dubai happiness meter, which the Dubai government is very proud of, and it's rolled out these interfaces all over public spaces across the city, and the same graphical interface appears on government websites so that you can rate you can report how you're feeling as you use them at certain times and on mobile devices. There was a rather extraordinary story reported in the news last year that the government, rather sort of innocently, that they thought this could seem like a reasonable idea, that if you hit the negative one enough times, that you'd get a visit from the police to come and find out why this was actually true, but to find out how that they could improve their service to you. And then there are these examples of real-time mood data dashboards. This is the London dashboard with 4% unhappier, 4% happier. So alongside all of these sort of transport data and weather data and the financial markets, that mood is now something that we can have hovering in the background as something that is rising and falling. This is something called the hedonometer, run by some data scientists at the University of Vermont that does sentiment analysis on Twitter to see how mood on Twitter is changing. There's probably a fall for Prince right now and this sort of thing. So you get these kind of events. This is one of the devices I put up earlier, actually, is a thing called Cell Packs. This attaches to this is a product aimed at employers who can try and keep track of how their employees are feeling. So this is partly my question to Tony about, is there not also a kind of production side version of what he was talking about? This would be an example of a sort of post-industrial but nevertheless production side version of it. And it generates data like this so that managers can get a sense of what's going on. Now, there is, as many people have talked about at the conference, what the media theorist Andrew McStay has called empathic media. These are media that detect your emotional state, but without you actually having to consciously, in whatever we mean by that, communicate it in some way. So it intuits it via That's affectiva through your smile and the movement of your eyes. This is the feel wearable. That's the happiest man in the world, Mathieu Ricard, having his brain studied by scientists in Wisconsin to see how he became so happy. And this is the Doppel wristband is a thing that gives you a fake pulse rate, which can calm you down through basically teaching your pulse to slow down by giving you a different rate to conform to. Now, these things are interesting, but I'm not actually going to be talking. Then they may end up being far more transformative in the long run than what I'm interested in, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about so much today. How are we doing for time? Okay. So I just want to make a few quick remarks about these sorts of interfaces. The first thing is to say, which quite interestingly, I think, particularly for an economic sociologist, and I'm interested in neoliberalism as well, have this slightly Weberian idea that our world is filling up with numbers everywhere, that everything is, we're living in this kind of iron cage of measurement and quantitative measurement. There's no numbers anywhere here, actually. And I think that's potentially quite interesting, and it's worth noting that the way in which mood is tracked in many cases, although it might facilitate quantification, it doesn't necessarily arise through quantification. And I think that's worth at least noting. Secondly, the choices that are offered, other with the exception of this one, tend to be binary ones of degrees of positivity and degrees of negativity. And again, I think this is interesting in terms of how these things are aspiring to work in whatever. Now, and you could say, as per those empathic media, that this is all rather low tech and that this is all going to get gradually superseded by facial scanning and somatic monitoring technologies. Firstly, I'm not convinced that that's a bit deterministic. But secondly, I think what's interesting about these is that they still treat consciousness as in some ways the site of value. So in some ways they continue a tradition that you could date back to Bentham of treating subjectivity as being a site of value, something that needs to be consulted in some way, and don't simply flip into a complete behaviorism, which is really what these things are doing. I mean, ultimately, I asked a question at one of the panels yesterday about the accuracy of these things. And of course, the question is, when you say how accurate are these, well, you're saying accurate back to some notion of subjective affect again. So I think there are more problems with, philosophical problems with these that need to be interrogated. Anyway, I'm going to stick to talking about these. Now, in terms of the kind of history that I'm interested in for this type of measurement and monitoring, one interesting starting point for this sort of thing would be this is the Beck Depression Inventory from 1961, created by Aaron Beck, also the inventor of, or the main instigator of cognitive behavioral therapy. And this was quite path-breaking at the time to create these sorts of scales to try and quantify affect, but specifically because of the problem and culturally, it wasn't that people didn't get depressed until the 1960s, but the way in which depression started to become reconceived at this time as a deflation of the self rather than as a conflict within the self, started to create this question of how to get a capture, how to get a hold on the forms of negativity that were developing, but also to develop new techniques for the instigation of positivity. Positive psychology came along with Martin Seligman's work. Martin Seligman was working not long after this. Now, these questions are not really what you would call real-time mood trackers. I do not feel like a failure. That's in some ways quite a sort of existential report on one's state of self, but it's not necessarily a report on it's not really a question about how you're feeling right at this minute. It wasn't long after that these sorts of questions came along. How satisfied are you with your life as a whole? This is one of the key questions used by happiness economists in surveys, or something like how anxious did you feel yesterday? And these tended to use, or these still tend to use rather, scales between 1 and 10. And you can get this sort of data, which is now produced by the Office for National Statistics, showing how happiness is distributed around the country. And this is a form of self-reported happiness. But it's not just self-reported in the sense that you rely on someone telling you how happy they are. It's also what you could call a self-evaluation as well, because it's inviting the self to step back from their situation and to give a kind of review of how things are going generally. This was quite a radical thing to do when it first arose in the mid-1960s, because up until this point, attitudinal research had tended to get people to focus on something external to themselves, or how do you feel about McDonald's or the Pope or the government or something. But this attempt to try and speak to an evaluating self who could stand back from their situation, offer a critical, dispassionate view of how it was going, and to report it, this was quite a radical thing to do. But nevertheless, it has some important methodological and epistemological flaws. It relies on what Daniel Kahneman calls the remembering self. So in some ways, it's a self which is being trusted to offer some, in some ways, accurate or honest or useful assessment of how things have gone in the recent and distant past. And this can be particularly if you're dealing with something like health economics. This sort of data is very important in health economics if you're trying to put different values on different types of disease in order to allocate investment in different areas. People will often report that a certain event in their life made them feel very unhappy, but actually they can often, people like Kahneman and others can show, will misremember actually how they felt at the time, which of course poses the question, well, what does it mean to know how you felt at the time? Now, in some ways this gets to a rather deep philosophical dilemma, and I think someone like Daniel Kahneman is very honest about the fact that there's no moral or political reason why the remembering self should be somehow deemed less useful or less authoritative than the experiencing self. But nevertheless, there are certain reasons why an experiencing self may be worth trying to tap into, trying to quantify, trying to measure the nature of that experience. But I think that the more you dig into this methodological problem, the more it appears actually as a philosophical and existential problem. I mean, it comes down to this distinction that Bergson makes here between perceptions that are clear and precise but impersonal, that is, this kind of evaluation of how I am, a statement of who I am or what I am or whatever, versus what he calls this confused, ever-changing, inexpressible type of perception, which is in some ways the question of how you are rather than what you are. And you could, I think in Heidegger there's the question of there's dual meaning of the verb to be, that in some ways, you know, is being something a sort of static, ontic or empirical relation, or is it something that is actually processual in time? And in order to try and get to this, not dissuaded by the philosophical challenge of this, in order to try and capture some of this experienced happiness, rather to get around the flaws of the remembering, evaluating self, there have been various techniques that have been introduced by psychologists over the last 30 years or 40 years or so to try and get around this, which tend to use sort of diary methods and so on. And I think what's interesting, I put in inverted commas real world and real time. These are sort of some of the phrases that get used in connection to these methods. And in what sense is it real? Well, real world basically means not going on within an enclosed space, such as a laboratory. And real time means not interrupted by the methodological intrusions of something like a survey instrument or an audit or something. So in some ways, these are the methods. These methods belong firmly in what Deleuze characterizes as societies of control. Because in Deleuze's account of societies of control, he says, I think the key moment in that essay is where he says that in the society of discipline, man, I think he says man, was always starting again, whereas in societies of control, one is never finished with anything. And there's this sense that, and you get this kind of flooding of public spaces, and that nothing is ever done with. There's never a sort of start and stop. It's just a sort of, and that in a way I think is what is when you see the words real in these sort of situations. Reach for your Deleuze, but of course there's also a kind of fundamental philosophical impossibility about some of these types of attempts to try and capture what is going on in the flow of experience. And there's been a lot more discussion about this at this conference than I was expecting, and I'm in some ways I feel a bit perhaps sort of like I'm speaking to people who know the phenomenology of this probably rather better than I do. But if you take Bergson's view of the distinction between temporal experience versus what are basically spatial or spatially dependent attempts to quantify experience, or quantify time, what Bergson argues that to understand time as pure duration is to recognize that it has no affiliation to number. It is something that is fundamentally antagonistic to attempts to apply numbers and scales to it. So in some ways, by trying to get to this, these happiness psychologists are grappling with a kind of philosophical impossibility. And I don't know if Natasha's still watching this, but in her wonderful book, Addiction by Design, I pulled out this quote, which is her description of the zone that gambling, the machine gambling addicts go into, a zone where they sort of lose themselves in the interactivity of the interface and the machine, which she describes as a zone beyond value with no social or economic significance. So again, I thought this is a rather telling in respect to my own interest in these practices of valuation, is that they are attempts to put value on something that is in some ways outside of the sphere of valuation, or outside of number. Now, one methodological solution to this that Daniel Kahneman suggests is what he calls approach or avoidance. So instead of asking people questions which involve putting things on a scale between 1 and 10, like these happiness survey people do, you ask them, are you impatient for your current situation to end, or would you prefer it to continue? So we see here this turn towards the binary as a way of trying to get around the problem of the evaluative self in some respects. And I think there's also resonances here with us. I don't know if there's a connection between this and cybernetics, but in some ways, the cybernetic account of behavior as regulated by adaptation to negative feedback seems to have an interesting resonance with this as well. Again, that is the feedback positive, in which case keep doing what you're doing, or is the feedback negative and requires some kind of adaptation? Partly because I'm interested in Hayek and neoliberalism, but also because I think it's interesting just to get us to challenge our assumption that numbers are what govern us in the phenomenology of our lives. Hayek, often seen as the most influential of the neoliberal thinkers, he described markets as telecommunication systems. They're ways of diverting information around complex systems. And for the people in the market, he says here, so it's rather a long quote, but he says it does not matter for him why at the particular moment more screws of one size than another are wanted. All that is significant is how much more or less difficult to procure they have become, or how much more or less urgently wanted are the alternative things he produces or uses. And reading this made me think of the sort of the language of the financial markets, which is I'm going long, or I'm going short, or that's a buy, or that's I think a piece of shit is how it's technically known in the financial world. There's sort of like positive versus negative orientation as the phenomenology of real-time experience, but also the way in which it can be captured potentially and turned into something, a matter of data. Now, how much time have I got? Because this is where... 10 minutes? Okay, fine. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the actual methods and interfaces that I've been doing some interviews with people who design and build, or the companies that sell and design these types of apps and interfaces. And I'm going to make sort of 3 comments about this, but some of this is still kind of in process, really. Now, the first is the question of how to sustain methods as interfaces. And I suppose I'm partly thinking by saying this, there's a great new paper out, is Norcha still here? By Norcha, Maras, and Carolyn Gerlitz on what they call interface methods, which are effectively platforms which can be used for epistemological purposes by one set of actors and for practical purposes by another set of actors. And in some ways, the challenge of the attempts to capture experience involve trying to ensure that the method doesn't appear as a method, but that it appears as an interface. And in order to appear as an interface, what is most important is that, and this is where I read Brandon Hookway's Heideggerian take on interfaces. I think it's just called Interface. But he talks about how it's in the nature of interfaces to disappear. And I interviewed a guy from a wearable technology company, and he kept bragging to me about how this technology disappears. It's the only one that disappears. And it was quite clear that this disappearance of the interface was key to how he understood the value of the product. But the question is, how do you somehow capture data on positive and negative affect in ways that allow people or keep people in a state of acting through something, across something, rather than to feel that they are in a situation of an epistemological situation of being sort of objectified in some way. And the first is, and this might sound banal, but I think there's actually something quite important in this, is good manners. The questions which get asked, these are the apps. This is basically, they interrupt you throughout the day, and they say, hey, how you, and one of them says, just checking in, and it's not actually up there. How are you? How are you feeling? How do you feel? And this is, and obviously the language of social media platforms is equally this kind of colloquial turn towards a sort of chatty inquiry. What's on your mind is Facebook. What's up, I think, is someone's probably on Twitter right now. But there's what's going on. These are the questions. And I think if we read this in the way that Wittgenstein would read it, these are not invitations to report states of affairs. These are moments to prompt interactivity. These are relational prompts rather than. I mean, you could say. Please tell us your mood on a scale of 1 to 10, and that would obviously, you couldn't make that claim. But I think that the manners and the etiquette of these sort of modes of inquiry are kind of important to how they survive or persist as interfaces. Second point to make is the importance of embodied reports. The Dubai happiness meter, I mean, this is kind of probably obvious, and I'm sure there's lots written about swiping and all this sort of stuff, but the importance of the single tap or the swipe up and down as being absolutely key to how these function methodologically. This is not kind of just a sort of, this is important to how they function epistemologically and methodologically. And I think, again, to challenge some of our sociological, maybe my own sociological assumptions, you think of how Foucault in Discipline Punish talks about the huge lengths that in the 19th century French school children were disciplined minutely in the use of the pen and the hand and so on, and this became a key way in which subjectivity was constructed in the society of discipline. That in some ways the sort of sense that the pen is, shut the pen away, just do, is in some ways the way in which you ensure that people treat this as an interface for expression rather than as a moment to issue a report. I interviewed a guy who built one of these workplace interfaces where you press a positive button and a negative button, and I said, what happens if someone just presses the negative one lots of times? And he said, well, that's data. You know, that's it. These things are not in and of themselves aspiring to some kind of traditional survey-like form of representation. Another point about how to maintain the interface. This is a mood tracking website called MoodScope, which is specifically for people with mood disorders. And the way you report how you're feeling, I mean, I'd almost not say report because it's trying not to make it a report, is to play with this card where you sort of click on it and you sort of turn it around and you do this. They have, this is based on some evidence that this practice engages parts of the brain that otherwise, if you tried to get someone to try and think too hard about how they were feeling, would not be engaged with. So there's a kind of like attempt to bring in some other aspect of consciousness. This is a bit different, really. But this is Happify is another positive psychology-based mood tracking app. But you play this game where you sort of try and kind of relax yourself in order to get more into the flow of the whole thing by zapping. You zap positive balloons and not negative ones. Now, I want to just, in the last few minutes, so there's clearly what's going on here is an attempt to avoid a kind of representative discourse or representational discourse. And I think that what's clearly happening, and it's true particularly for some of these sort of websites that are focused on helping people with depression, is that there's not just an attempt to track data or collect data, but there is also what you could call an augmentation of mood. There is an attempt to try and transform the mood. This is obviously quite deliberate where it's something which is based on positive psychology, but you could argue that it is in the very nature of this methodology that it has an augmentational tendency. And you could also argue that it has a positivity bias, even when it's not being put in the service of alleviating depression or some kind of positive psychology agenda. And I think that part of the problem here, as everyone knows, the key design challenge of any wearable or tracking app or anything is that people will just stop using it, or they'll put it away or whatever, or they'll ignore the interface. And I think that apart from trying to get some assessment of how people feel at certain moments in relation to the world, they have to carry on feeling positive about the interface. So I think there's kind of simple methodological reasons why the interface has to have some type of positivity bias, or if not necessarily a positivity bias, at least a bias, a bias towards some type of what you could call an emotional augmentation, which keeps them coming back to this interface. And I think that, I think we have to take seriously the question of why do people stop using wearables to the extent that they do, or stop tracking. I mean, you can ask why do people take it up, but why do they stop it? And I think one reason is that in some ways, I mean, Hookway talks about all interfaces being both systems of limitation of the subject, but also augmentation. And I think too often there's too much limitation, i.e., oh God, I have to do this, and there's not enough actual augmentation, and that the reasons for wanting to use the interface are not clearly articulated enough. And I think this must be a constant design challenge in the world of wearables. Arlie Hochschild's wonderful book, and in some ways a kind of key account of a very early account of post-Fordism in the Managed Heart. This is actually based on a study of airline hostesses, but anyway, there's interested in how sort of emotion becomes augmented by acts of management. I mean, the other thing which I think is interesting here is that, so you take something like the happiness meter in Dubai, they take it as read that having these meters everywhere is going to turn Dubai into what they call the happiest city on earth. And in some ways, that this kind of feedback mechanism it has a kind of a positivity bias built into it. Anyway, so I'm just going to finish by talking just briefly about how then does they go back to some kind of representational moment, because so often, and we've heard a lot in this conference about data and people datafying themselves and so on, but actually the moment of datification comes later, actually. There has to be a time lag in order, if you're not in all cases, not if you're kind of weighing yourself or something like that, but in the case of what I'm talking about, the time lag between being in the state of flow and the state of experience and then somehow getting out of it back into a state of observation, critical distance, evaluation, objectification, this is important. And I think one thing which I might do with my interviews with these people is try and spot all of the moments where they suddenly use the word validity or fact or representativeness. Because it's quite interesting that they have to abandon that rhetoric in order for their interfaces to succeed, and yet suddenly it kind of comes back in at key moments to say, no, we're going to try and make sure that you get facts, you're going to get you're going to get something valid. And one of them, the people who build the employee well-being tracker in the office, they talk about what their tool can do is produce what they call a brutal fact that managers will suddenly get alerted to. But the question I think we have to ask, and this is in some ways a whole sort of research project in its own right, is what is it that determines the length of the delay? Mark Hansen, in his book Feed Forward, talks about, and he's talking more about unconscious sensing rather than the type of consciousness tracking that I'm talking about. But still, there's this question of the data will be collected, we will not be conscious of it, or we'll be in some state of flow, and then later there'll be an intrusion of a set of facts. And we don't know exactly why or for what reason this intrusion will happen. And I think one example, I'm just going to finish with this, is you know, you take the example of something like psychiatric diagnosis, and a lot of these mood tracking apps, people take their data to the doctor, because I mean, one of the problems of this kind of constant fluctuation is that the question is, well, what point is it critical? Being in a state of, you know, never being finished with anything means that the question of, well, when is the right moment to jump from a feeling of depression, in this instance, as Alan Ehrenberg talking about, to saying that I am depressed. And for Ehrenberg, this is a kind of fundamental problem of the nature of depression in its late 20th century formation. I think what's interesting, you take something like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 2 from 1980, which is the transformative, sort of turns American psychiatry into this much more positivist discipline. It introduces this arbitrary 2-week cutoff where symptoms have to be present before a diagnosis can be made. So there's this question of what are the delays of a society of tracking between the experiences that we inhabit and the facts that get produced. So I'm going to stop there.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.